This disagreement. So we present survey results on carbon pricing recommendations and climate policy design issues from almost 500 experts around the globe. And each of these experts was asked to give advice to a hypothetical world government, as well as to the government in her own country. The policy design questions focused on instrument choice, on the question of border carbon adjustment, as well as on the usage of the revenues from carbon pricing. So let me first give you the key results in a nutshell and then go a little bit more into the details. Here on the top, you see the median and the mean carbon price recommendations for the world government scenario. So where there's a global government that sets a uniform global carbon price for all countries in the world. And the experts were giving advice on the recommended carbon price to such a hypothetical government. And for the year 2020, we arrived at a median global carbon price of 40 US dollars and a mean 40, around 50. And then it goes up for 2030 to 70, respectively 91, or for 2050, around $100 as the median recommendation and around $200 the mean recommendation. Almost twice as many experts favor to implement a carbon price via a tax rather than cap and trade than vice versa. And a large majority of the experts strongly recommends the usage of border carbon adjustment under unilateral carbon pricing if that is feasible. The recommendations on the usage of the revenues from carbon pricing vary quite substantially, so there's not such a clear picture here. However, somewhat surprisingly, we do not find very strong support for full reimbursement or a so-called carbon dividend. An interesting finding is also that experts who favor a tax over cap and trade tend to recommend significantly higher carbon prices. I will skip the literature overview for reasons of time, for the time being at least. I move on with the following observation. Last year, something which I find quite remarkable, there have been public statements from various economists on the issue of carbon pricing, and in particular requesting the implementation of carbon prices. And I find that quite astonishing, because I think economists, they're usually busy with their research and they tend not to sign such statements. Yeah, so I think this is a remarkable observation. And also the sheer size of these, several thousand economists in each case. So there was the American one, only that could only be signed by American economists, the so-called economist statement on carbon dividends, and then a similar one from European economists. So what's our approach? Rather than calculating the optimal carbon price from some fundamentals, our strategy is to ask experts directly about their recommendations on carbon prices. Sorry. Our definition of a potential expert on carbon pricing is that this person should be an author or co-author of at least 2 cited publications on or related with the topic of carbon pricing since the year 2000. And then we constructed our sample of experts by first defining keywords such as carbon tax, cap and trade, and a number of other combinations of terms. And Then we conducted an automated literature search in the database Scopus to identify scientific papers related with the topic. And this strategy led to a sample of around 2,500 potential experts on carbon pricing around the globe. And we sent emails in a more or less automatized way to these experts around the globe, asking them to participate in our online survey. And out of these 2,500, close to 500 finally responded to our survey questions. So this is what the first survey question actually looked like. So I show here directly the screen that you would have seen if you had or possibly even have participated in our survey. And it's the first survey question. It's a little bit blurry, but I will read it out to you. The first question in the survey was, suppose that a world government exists that seeks to maximize the well-being of all present and future people and plans to implement a uniform global carbon price measured in real US dollars per ton of CO2. Which carbon price would you recommend to the world government for the following years? And then you could insert here your price recommendation for the year 2020, say, for example, $80. Which range of carbon prices would you still be comfortable with recommending? And then you could insert here, for example, your range that you still find acceptable, for example, from $50 to $150, just for example. And then the same thing for 2030 and 2050. And for the other survey questions, I only give a very quick short summary. So they were more lengthy in the actual survey than I present them here. The second question was that each person should specify the country that she gives carbon price recommendations on in the unilateral case. The next question was asking for a carbon price recommendation for the expert's own country. So unilateral carbon pricing under the assumption that a border carbon adjustment scheme can be implemented. Next question was the same as the third question, but without the border carbon adjustment. So unilateral carbon pricing without BCA. Question number 5, if your country implements a carbon pricing scheme unilaterally, would you strongly recommend introducing BCA if that is possible? Next question was on the recommended instrument choice, carbon tax, cap and trade, and then with a number of modifications with or without a price floor and price cap and other instruments. Question number 7 asked for the recommended usage of the revenues from carbon pricing. I only give a few examples. We gave a list of possible options, for example, general government spending, equal lump sum transfers to households, or spending on environmental public goods. And then in the last question, we try to elicit some possible drivers of carbon price recommendations related with issues such as catastrophic climate change, discounting, etc. So this chart here gives an overview of the main summary statistics for the global world government scenario, so uniform global carbon price. I will not read out the numbers. Basically, you've seen the most important ones already. So let me actually move on to the next slide. So this one gives an overview of the distribution of the price recommendations, so the point recommendations. So we recall that for the pricing questions, in each case we were asking for point recommendations, so which price would you recommend? And then we were also asking for the ranges, which range of prices would you still be comfortable with recommending. So this chart is only about the point recommendations on the carbon prices. And you see the blue bars for the year 2020, red one for 2030, and green for 2050. And as you can see, the probability mass, or the mass of recommendations, of course, shifts towards higher prices as we move from 2020 to 2030 and 2050. So it's shifting to the right. That's not very surprising. Carbon prices are generally supposed to be increasing over time. Another observation from this is that there are certain focal prices, so prices which are recommended frequently, for example, $30, $50, $80, $100, and then also $200. And you also note that this here is not a linear scale, but for prices above 100, we were compressing here. So these bars here contain all the prices above 100 and below 200, basically. So this is a wide range summarized by only this bar here, and these are all above 200. So you see here clearly the focal prices 100 and 200, which are almost as high as all the prices in between. And the next the most important observation is probably, apart from the focal prices, that these distributions are very skewed. So you have a large probability mass at moderate carbon prices, but then you have still also a quite large probability mass at really much higher carbon prices. So it's a highly skewed probability distribution for each of these years. Checking for the time. So this chart gives you again the median and the mean values of the price recommendations and the price ranges that we asked for. And what you see, so for the mean prices here in blue and the median prices here in orange, of course, they're increasing over time. And the mean prices are always higher than the median prices, which is a result of this strong skewedness of the data set. Okay. Here you see the distribution of prices for question number 3, unilateral carbon pricing for your own country with BCA. And I skip directly to the next one without BCA. It looks very similar, just that the probability mass is slightly towards the left without BCA. So let me go back. Here you see that the probability mass switches to the right when you switch on the BCA option, which is not very surprising. So this chart here is very important. So let me spend 2 minutes on it, maybe. We compare here across the 3 scenarios. So scenario question 1 was global uniform carbon price, the world government scenario. Question 3 was unilateral carbon pricing for your own country with border carbon adjustment, and question number 4, unilateral without border carbon adjustment. And on the top, you see the median price recommendations. On the bottom, you see the mean price recommendations, and the main difference is that the mean values are always a bit higher than the median values, again reflecting the skewedness in the data. But the most important observations are the following 2. First of all, comparing question 4 and question 3 with, this is the unilateral carbon pricing with BCA, and this is without for the year 2030 here, for example. You see that there's a drop in the recommended median prices, or in the mean prices here. Also for 2020, there's a drop, but the drop is not as, I find it's not as significant. Yeah, there's a drop, but it's way more moderate than I personally expected. I expected a much bigger drop. Yeah, because the border carbon adjustment allows to protect your domestic industries from carbon leakage, etc. So I expected the BCA to have a stronger impact on the prices. So it's somewhat surprising that this drop is not as pronounced as I was expecting it. But even more surprising is when you compare question 1 and question 3, the global government or the world government scenario, for example, here, with the unilateral carbon pricing with BCA. And we find that the average carbon price recommendation in the global uniform carbon pricing case here leads to a lower average carbon price than the average recommendation of experts to their own government, unilateral carbon pricing with BCA. And that is a complete surprise, because if you are familiar with the literature, you should be aware of the free riding incentive, and the free riding incentive in climate policy is very, in the literature, it's used as one of the main explanations or drivers for lack of effective climate policy, in the absence of an effective global climate contract. So we would expect to observe free riding here. We would expect to see the unilateral carbon price recommendations to be much smaller than the global uniform ones. And we find the opposite, the unilateral ones are higher. That may be partially related with a certain bias in our data. The experts, of course, they don't come from all countries with the same probability, but there are certain countries where the experts, of course, they are much more experts on carbon pricing in some countries than in others. So this may be partially related with that, but I cannot give a full explanation here. But keep in mind that we don't find evidence for free riding incentives. The results for the BCA question, border carbon adjustment, is overwhelmingly positive. So experts, the blue part here, strongly recommend, a large fraction of experts strongly recommends to implement BCA if that is possible. Instrument choice is also quite a strong result. Here the blue one is the carbon tax. So these experts recommend to implement a carbon price in their own country under the assumption that no carbon pricing scheme has been implemented yet via a carbon tax. And here in orange, cap and trade with price collar, and in gray, cap and trade without price collar. And then the yellow and green ones are others. So we find almost twice as much experts recommending carbon tax than cap and trade. It's also quite a strong result. And this one here is very interesting and a little bit intriguing. So we split up the sample by looking, first of all, at those experts who recommend a carbon tax, and next at those experts who recommend a cap and trade scheme. And then we look at the mean carbon price recommendations of each of these subgroups separately. And we find that the carbon tax favoring people on average recommend significantly higher carbon prices across all our scenarios than the cap and trade folks. So for some reason, people who like a carbon tax more than cap and trade, they tend to recommend significantly higher carbon prices, higher by about 30 to 40%. And that's really an interesting observation for which I don't have an explanation at the moment. The usage of revenues question here is not such a clear picture, but somewhat surprising. The equal lump sum transfers to households or carbon dividend option was only chosen by about 25% of the experts, while green R&D was chosen by almost 2/3 of the experts. That's somewhat surprising, but let me not go deeper into it for reasons of time. And then before I come to the end, just one more thing. So we look here at the statistics that considers a certain price, for example, $50, a carbon price of $50 for question 1, and then considers in the recommended price ranges that the experts were indicating, how many % of the experts have indicated carbon price ranges that they find acceptable, which contain a price of $50. Okay, and then this is interesting because it gives you an idea of possible space for agreement among the experts in spite of their different recommendations in the point recommendations. And we find there's a fair amount of space for agreement. For example, around 60% of the experts find a carbon price of $30 acceptable, but almost as many also a carbon price of $50. Okay, so in this range here lies the biggest space for agreement for the year 2020. And for the year 2030, I'm not showing you the chart, but around half of the experts consider a price of either $50 or $60 per ton still as acceptable, but also almost as many would still consider a price of 100 acceptable. Okay, let me conclude. Carbon pricing remains highly controversial, yet we find considerable space for agreement. A large fraction of experts could agree on a price that they would still find acceptable. Surprising is that we find little evidence for free riding in our data. A large majority of experts strongly recommends the usage of border carbon adjustment under unilateral carbon pricing if that is possible. More experts favor a carbon tax over cap and trade than vice versa. And experts who favor a tax tend to recommend considerably higher carbon prices than experts who favor cap and trade. I have an Outlook slide. Shall I skip it? I'm asking to the session chair. Shall I skip it? Or?
You still have 1 minute, so you
okay,
can...
that's just enough for the Outlook. So what we still want to do, but we haven't done it yet, is to analyze the drivers of the carbon price recommendations in order to be able to better explain our observations. We haven't done that yet. We also plan to do a country level analysis of experts' recommendations, and some preliminary results indicate that experts from those countries that already have carbon prices or fairly high carbon prices implemented, these people also tend to recommend higher carbon prices as both to their own government as well as globally to a hypothetical world government. And we have also constructed a simple theoretical model with biased experts, and this little exercise may help to explain under what circumstances it's rather the mean price that we should look at, or that policymakers should look at, or the median price that the policymakers should look at. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the very interesting presentation and perfect timing. I see in the chat we already have one question from Santanu. If the others want to raise question, they can either write in the chat, have a question, or write the question. Santanu, if you're there and you want to raise the question yourself, you're free to talk now. Or otherwise, I will read it.
Yeah, I can read it. So first of all, thank you, Robert, for the really nice and interesting presentation. So I was just curious, given your distribution of the point estimates and the other distribution of the pricing. So just curious about where the experts come from, from what geographies and stuff, specifically because I think I was more thinking on what you kind of outlined in your Outlook slide. So experts can have different models of the world in the mind. So they might have different experiences about particular type of instrument working or not, and that might bias their, their response to what should be an ideal global, carbon price. So just curious. So that's why I raised this question. So just curious about distribution of experts.
So the question is, what is the distribution of responses from different geographies?
Yeah.
So we have looked a little bit into this, but not very much. So all I can say is very preliminary and maybe subject to changes. But what we have found in this preliminary thing is when you look at different world regions, so we grouped countries in different world regions basically. And then when looking at the results split up by these world regions, the results were not so strikingly different. So the distributions looked quite similar still. So it seems the differences seem to be more dramatic when you go into the country level analysis. So when you look at individual countries, even European countries, they can be quite divergent. So the carbon price recommendations can be quite divergent when looking at specific countries, even within a single world region. And these differences, I think, are more dramatic than the differences when you compare across different world regions. This is what I found somewhat interesting, and the only explanation so far that I have, but we may work on that and we may find other explanations. So the only one I have for the time being is the exposure of experts to carbon pricing schemes in their own countries. So what I've already mentioned here is experts who live in a country that already have a carbon pricing scheme and with a fairly high carbon price, they tend to also favor higher carbon prices. And that, of course, I mean, there are two possible dimensions here. One thing is to say that, wow, the policymakers are actually listening to their experts. So one possible explanation is that policymakers actually implement what the experts say, but the other explanation, and I personally have, I think the second one is more plausible, is that the experts themselves are influenced in their thinking about carbon pricing by their own exposure to an existing carbon pricing scheme. But that's all I can say for the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And then we can collect the last question from Noemi.
Hi, thanks, Robert, for the presentation. I have two small points a bit related to the previous question. One regarding your sample. Did you have a look at the distribution of respondents versus non-respondents, in the sense that you said you have about 2,500 emails sent to experts and then 500 responses. So is there any kind of bias that you could see in terms of who is responding and who is not? And then related to the geography. So in terms of the difference of the recommendation between the carbon price for the world government and unilateral carbon prices, can it be that, for instance, experts from developed countries would recommend a lower carbon price because they take into account that for developing countries, a high carbon price would be very difficult to implement? Like if you add a tax on coal in India, probably you cannot have a $40 carbon price on that, because that would be really unfeasible for Indian households. And that's very different for European households. And maybe if you look at the country of origin of the experts, you could find some kind of explanation.
Yeah, so thanks. Were you finished?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So for both questions, I have to say that we haven't really done it yet. So the non-response bias, we simply haven't looked at it yet, but we are definitely planning to do it. So we have it on the screen, but until now we've only done a very preliminary analysis of our data. So we haven't looked into it yet. So I cannot answer, unfortunately. And the second question, we also definitely have it on the screen. So yes, it's quite plausible that experts coming from developing countries would recommend lower prices because they are more concerned that a higher carbon price might hurt the economic development of their country. On the other hand, if experts from developed countries are altruistic, they should also take this into account, and we should be able to see these effects by comparing price recommendations to a global government, to a world government, and looking at carbon price recommendations for the expert's own country. And if the expert comes from, say, from the US and recommends a high carbon price for the own country, but then a moderate carbon price for the global scenario, that may be because this expert thinks that the own economy is not so vulnerable. So it may well have a higher carbon price, but in the global case, being altruistic, taking into consideration that for other countries it may be harmful. And another expert from a developing country, if this person recommends a low carbon price for the own country, but then also a moderate carbon price for the global, that would be consistent. Again, the analysis has not been done yet, so this remains to be done.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Robert. You can stop sharing your screen, and I ask Thomas Renström if he can share his own screen. And we can now move to the second presentation of today. There is a title, Can Subsidies Rather Than Pollution Taxes Break the Trade-off Between Economic Output and Environmental Protection? Thomas, you can share the screen and start your presentation. I will tell you when you have 2 minutes left.
Let me see, I'm going to pick one. Okay, so can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, very good. Let's see, I'll just check the time as well. Okay, so this paper is with Luca Spataro at University of Pisa and Laura Marsigliani at Durham University. And let's see, where is the... I think I have a toolbar which is blocking things.
I want to go to your next page. Oh, right, yes.
Okay, this paper is about corporate social responsibility. That's the view that we take on it. And the idea is behind corporate social responsibility is that decision makers of the company will do different decisions, take different decisions than they otherwise would have done. And this may be to a a different moral view or potentially due to externalities. So in general, I think the theory is quite underdeveloped on this front. But the idea is that the consumer, through their own individual actions, are able to influence either through the channel of demand for the goods, say by greener goods. The firms would respond by indirectly through prices, producing more of the greener goods, or through the finance channel, if consumers prefer green assets, there would be potentially a premium, a higher cost of capital if the firm is polluting. So potentially there are two channels through which corporate social responsibility can work. And I think the demand side is better understood, how just individual preferences for green goods can induce firms to produce them. But perhaps less so the finance side. We're going to look at the finance side in this paper. And we're going to ask ourselves if individual concerns for the environment will induce... sorry? Will induce firms to cleaner goods, to produce cleaner goods or just cleaner production. Now, there are various ways in which shareholders or individual investors can do this. One is through just being a passive shareholder. So households choose shares in greener firms to a greater extent than in other firms. I'll come to the reason perhaps why. Now that is going to alter the cost of capital and induce firms to produce in a cleaner way or engage more in abatement. And there are a few papers on that also which we have written on, but I'm not going through the literature as such. The other potential channel is if we have active shareholders. So I buy shares in a dirty firm in order to exercise my voting rights to make the firm produce in a cleaner way. And there are a few papers along those lines as well. But what we're going to do in this paper to ask ourselves about the government role in situations where we have ethical investors. And we're going to look at passive shareholders with a preference for holding green shares rather than non-green shares. And we're going to ask, what is the role of government intervention in such a world? And in particular, what is the role or the consequences of tax policy? So I am going just to skip this. So we're looking at H investors or H consumers. They're all going to be identical. We just want to keep a track of individuals, individual level, to be clear about what individuals are taking into account and what they don't, or what they take as given. So take a household which gets utility from consumption at day T. Now we have dropped labor supply in this model. It generally doesn't change anything, but for simplicity. The key thing here is a perceived pollution of the investor's portfolio. So we're assuming that individuals get this utility if the perceived pollution content of their shareholdings is high, and these are warm glow preferences. So it's not the case that the pollution individuals realize that they actually affect the pollution in equilibrium, and therefore prefer to reduce pollution by holding fewer of the shares. It's rather that individuals just feel good about holding green shares, and I think that's presumably a realistic description of how individuals think and tend to think. They just feel good about perhaps buying cleaner products if we had such a model, or in this case, they just feel good about holding green shares. And that is the perceived pollution, and that's going to be proportional to the pollution content and the shareholding of the household. But I'll come to that in a while. And so the choice of the household are two things. They're going to choose the consumption over time. They will have their wage income. Each household has 1 unit of labor, so we just have the wage rate there. We allow for the government for a lump sum tax, or alternatively a lump sum transfer. But the key thing is the portfolio choice. So individuals have a choice of investing in firm J. They will get return on equity from firm A. The weight is omega in firm J, and we just sum across all of the firms. So this is the total weight on firms equity, of firms equity. Now the other share is just invested the risk-free rate of return. We take that to be the return on government bonds. So government bonds is the clean asset, while the other firms are potentially dirty assets. Now the portfolio choice will immediately give rise to a pollution premium. So let's see, there's a typo here. The denominator should be marginal utility of consumption. So what we have is the marginal rate of substitution between pollution and consumption times the pollution content of firm J. So that is the marginal utility of pollution is negative. So that is the perceived pollution cost converted into consumption units. And that will then have to be equal to the value of the firm in consumption units times the pollution premium. So what we have is an expression for the pollution premium. The greater the pollution content is, the greater the required rate of return of that firm will have to be. And that's the channel through which those ethical preferences are going to work. The household then the firm can then affect the pollution by abating. So each unit of production causes a fraction of pollution. Now the firm can give up some of the production value in order to abate some of the pollution. So we assume an abatement technology. This is the Copeland and Taylor approach. And we're going to look at the incentive for the firms to abate more through this channel. So the firms, they are going to choose not only how much to abate, but they're also going to choose how much labor to employ, and they're also going to choose how much to invest. Now there is a government in there, and that is the focus of the paper. So the government has the ability to tax pollution by the firm. So that's another incentive for the firm to reduce pollution. It also has the ability to subsidize abatement or the resources put into abatement, and thereby affect pollution. And we're going to look at the relationship between taxes and subsidies. The next bit is looking at the equilibriums aggregating across all firms, and we get an aggregate expression for physical capital. The main thing here is that there is a fraction of output, which we call psi, which is the the fraction of output dedicated to abatement. So what is left is 1 minus psi. Now, the firm's optimal abatement will depend on, again, there's a typo here, so it should be marginal utility of consumption rather than the pollution in the denominator. But they realize that they take the household's marginal rate of substitution between pollution and consumption as given, because that is the aggregate. But what they can affect is their individual level of pollution and the pollution premium. So they take that into account when choosing how much to abate. They also take into account the subsidy of the government and the pollution tax. So that is the first order condition for the firms. And then we have the consumption Euler equation as well, which will look like which will look as usual. There is no difference there. And well, this is a condition that we need eventually when evaluating our tax reform. So we just assume that the depreciation rate is not too high and the abatement technology is not too odd looking. So this is our sufficient condition for saddle path stability. And then we can go on and look for the results. I'm just checking my time to see how much I have. Yeah, I still have quite some.
You have 7 minutes.
Yeah, that's good. So we're first looking at the tax reforms, and we're asking what happens to steady state quantities if we increase the pollution tax. And the pollution tax will reduce steady state capital, while an increase in the subsidy will increase steady state capital. And the reason is the pollution tax is just going to lower capital's marginal products, so it will be optimal in equilibrium to have lower capital. When it comes to the subsidy, it's like a subsidy actually on production. It's going to increase capital's marginal products, so that's why capital in equilibrium will be greater with a subsidy. So they work in different ways. But what about the pollution? The pollution tax will always reduce steady state pollution, and while in the subsidies is on abatement is not clear. On one hand, if you subsidize abatement, firms will abate more, but they will also produce more because capital is more productive. It's a subsidy on production. So the net effect may very well be that pollution increases. And the same goes for consumption, given that capital is lower under a pollution tax. In equilibrium, consumption will also be lower. Again, the subsidy is ambiguous. And the other thing of this model is the pollution premium, the required excess return on dirty assets in this model. The pollution tax is going to reduce steady state pollution, steady state pollution premium, and the reason is that the firms then are going to pollute less, so there is less required excess return by the socially responsible investors. But again, the subsidy we cannot say anything about because it can go both ways. So we are looking at a numerical computation of the model, where we compare where we look at the effects of the pollution tax and the abatement subsidy. Now, the pollution tax has a stronger effect on pollution than subsidy for obvious reasons that I just explained. But for our computations, yes, the subsidy will reduce pollution. Now, looking at the consumption we knew that the pollution tax reduces consumption, but here the abatement subsidy will increase consumption. So the subsidy can actually increase aggregate consumption at the same time as reducing pollution. I haven't said anything about whether it's optimal or not, because these are tax reforms. And that's the other thing. Typically for optimal tax rates, one would like to implement a pigou tax, even though individuals have green preferences. So it's not enough that individuals have green preferences to solve an externality problem. And the pollution tax will dominate when it comes to optimal policy. But if there's an argument for a subsidy that one doesn't want to give up too much of economic activity in order to reduce pollution, well then the subsidy can work. And the instruments they work in an environment where individuals have green preferences. So I think I will stop there and take questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. We have more time for question then, because we spare 2 minutes. So I invite people in the room to raise a question in the chat, either by stating I have a question or by formulating their own question. Or I try to do. Okay, no, okay. Noemi has a question, otherwise I would have picked the room. Okay, Noemi, you can raise a question if you want.
Thanks. I have a question regarding the fiscal side, say, in the sense that how do your results change depending on what you do with the tax receipts, or how you finance the abatement costs?
Yes, that's a good question. So what we do is to allow for government budget balance. Now, in this tax reform paper, we only have the lump sum tax in there. So if we increase the pollution tax, it will be a reduction in lump sum tax, or alternatively a transfer. Now, given that there are no distortionary taxes in here as such, there are no taxes on capital or labor, so there will be recorded equivalence. It doesn't matter at what point in time the government redistributes those tax revenues, but and we can think of it as just period by period budget balance if you want, or just a sequence of redistribution, and that's the same for the subsidy. So in order to give the subsidy, the government has to raise the lump sum tax. Now, it would be different if we had distortionary taxes in there. So the idea of the double dividend, Bovenberg and Moy and others. So if we were to increase the pollution tax and reduce the pre-existing distortionary tax, yes, things will look different. Presumably one would get more mileage out of that. I can't say what will happen to pollution in absolute level, but yes, but we haven't looked at that. So yeah.
Thanks.
If there are no other questions, I can raise one question when I invite the other to use the chat. I have a question. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for a very inspiring presentation. I have a question regarding the effectiveness of the policy. So if we think about what we know about the way policy works, we know that even if they are designed perfectly, their effectiveness maybe depends on the way people react to the existence of the policy. This holds true for taxes and also for subsidies, either if we look at firms or consumers. I was thinking if you have considered a way to include the role of effectiveness of the policy within the model to try to discount the subsidy when it's not that effective, or discounting the tax when it's not that effective?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, you're raising a point there, the effectiveness of the subsidy. So in this world, in the model, if the households are not driven by ethical considerations or these green preferences for when investing, and there are no pollution taxes, then the subsidy towards abatement has no effect. There will be no incentive for the firm to change their abatement even though they're subsidized. So it's like it becomes just a subsidy, a profit subsidy, the subsidy on abatement. So there will still the optimum choice is not to abate anything. But it works when the household have those green preferences. So in that sense, we could actually expand a little bit on that. But we could also do other things, presumably. It requires, if the firms are heterogeneous, it requires information of the individual. So if we're going to subsidize, say, abatement, it requires information at firm level, which government may not have, and there may be differences in there. But that's something that we may look at in the future. We also looked at an alternative formulation. We have that in a new version of the paper where the firms are using a polluting input rather than doing abatement, but we're sure we can reduce a model with a polluting input exactly into the model that we already have. But yeah, we'll leave that for the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you.
We can move to the third presentation of the day, that it will be again presented by Thomas instead of Laura Marsigliani. The paper will be the same, of course, and it is titled Optimal Environmental Taxation in the Presence of Pollution and Congestion, a General Equilibrium Analysis. So, Thomas, again, the floor is yours.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will. I'll just have to find if I click on that thing, and then I am going to see what happens if I do the sharing the screen and not. Yeah, this is the one.
We can see it.
Okay, thank you. So this is about also environmental taxation and pollution, and this joint work with Chao Chama at University of Leeds and Laura Marsigliani at Durham. And we're looking at the pollution due to transport. So, okay, now it works. So when we think of air pollution, vehicles are perhaps the main culprit, or one of the main culprits of at least urban air pollution. And there are measures in place which government use to try to reduce pollution emissions. They can use taxes or congestion charges, or standards industry incentives, or even subsidies perhaps for cleaner technology in vehicle production. But we're going to ask ourselves in this paper, what is the optimal fuel taxation and vehicle taxation. We are formulating a vintage model where cars live for more than one period, and we want to look at the consequences or what the taxes should be in general equilibrium. So I think I'm skipping the literature just to say that there are a few papers out there looking at optimal taxation of fuel, but we want to combine the theories of vintage with optimal PIGU taxation. So I'll come to the model, and the main thing, or perhaps the more important thing in this model, is to think about what vehicles are, and how they're produced, and what's meant by the various vintages. So to make things simple, we're allowing for two vintages, new cars and old cars. And well, a car, once it's produced, it becomes a new car in the next period, and an old car is actually 2 years old. But that doesn't matter too much. So each car is going to give mileage or transport services to the owner, and we assume that the transport services or the mileage is proportional to gasoline. So doubling the gasoline will double the distance you can go, or the mileage you get out of it. The other thing are the attributes of the car. I'll come to those in a while. There are two attributes, delta and A, but one will be fuel efficiency, and the other one will be vehicle capital. The difference between new cars and old cars is that old cars depreciate, so you get less mileage out of an old car, everything else equal. So we allow for that rho to be smaller than 1. And vehicle production, as I said, is done in one period in advance. But the main thing is the fuel efficiency and vehicle capital. So fuel efficiency, how efficient is the engine, so for the same amount of petrol you can go, or you can go further, or vehicle capital. So perhaps the quality of the car or the size of the car. Yeah, if it's bigger, you can put more people into the car, and you can do your household transport. You can get more out of household transport for the same amount of petrol. Now, the choice between fuel efficiency and vehicle capital, well, that's up to the firm. So the firm is employing physical capital and labor to produce an output which can be linearly transformed into either vehicle capital or fuel efficiency. We take that technology for simplicity. And the firm's problem then is the price of the equilibrium price for vehicles, we call that Q or QA. And what the firm is selling is the whole product. So it's fuel efficiency times the attribute of the vehicle. So it's delta times A, which is the vehicle which is being priced. Other than that, the firm is paying the rental cost of capital and labor, potentially a subsidy on production of fuel efficient cars. However, in this paper, we actually are not looking at, we do that in another paper. So in this paper, we have subsidy to 0. We're just looking for the optimal taxes. The we assume constant returns to scale in vehicle production, which means that doubling K and L, capital and labor in production, we should double the vehicles. So we should double delta times A. So that is not a doubling of delta or doubling of A, but delta times A, meaning that for constant returns to scale, we need the production F to be homogeneous of degree 1/2 in order to preserve that. The ordinary goods production, well, constant returns to scale, production function G. Now, looking at pollution, because that's going to influence the tax structure or the optimal tax structure. So we assume that pollution is proportional to gasoline use, but we make the assumption that the more fuel efficient the car is, the less pollution it produces. So fuel efficiency is doing two things here. On one hand, is actually reducing the amount of gasoline that is required for driving a certain distance, but at the same time, it's also reducing pollution for the same amount of gasoline. Now, we could have perhaps separated those technologies and think of emissions-friendly technologies as well. But for simplicity, we did it. So it's we have one dimension, but it's actually doing things in two dimensions, both pollution and fuel efficiency. And let's see here. So the household gets utility from consumption and leisure. They also get utility from environmental quality. We could have done it that the household got this utility from pollution, but we model environmental quality as a state. Now, if there wasn't any pollution at all, the environmental quality would converge to phi divided by epsilon. So there's a natural level of the environment. It's not the case that the environment explodes into an infinite amount or disappears, but it naturally converges to a steady state level. If we increase, if we have pollution, well, the steady state level would be phi minus p divided by epsilon. So pollution would also lower that steady state level. But that's important to notice. Now, the key thing about the different vintages here is that we have old cars and we have new cars giving driving services, and they're imperfect substitute. I wanted to capture the idea that we're only looking at an aggregate household. So we have an aggregate household who's going to drive family members in different places, and then it's imperfect substitutes between the old and new cars, in the sense that you would need both to do all of these services. So rather than packing the car with all the family members and then driving around and dropping them off, you have two cars going around with fewer family members. Otherwise, you would just use the most fuel efficient cars. The other car would just be redundant. You would have a corner solution. So there are imperfect substitutes, and I think that's important. Then eventually we have congestion externalities. So I've looked at the pollution one, but the congestion externalities, and here it has nothing to do with whether the car is fuel efficient or not. It's just the time it's on the road, that's when it causes the congestion. So it's the mileage driven. So we look at the household is going to solve, maximize the utility of the dynasty. So we have consumption, leisure, driving services. We have the congestion externality. Actually, I should have had the semicolon here, because the household cannot choose or realize that it influences, takes congestion as given, and it takes the state of the environment as given. But the budget constraint is the usual one, apart from thinking about the taxes now on gasoline and vehicles. So let's look at the gasoline. So we have the price of gasoline P, and tau is the tax on gasoline. So it's a unit tax, not an lowering, but it doesn't change things. It's on the quantity of gasoline. But we distinguish in principle between old and new vehicles. It may sound strange, but I'll come to that. So think of a different tax on petrol for old vehicles and a different tax for new vehicles. So that means that at the gas station, one has to be able to distinguish between new vehicles and old vehicles and then charge a different price. That may not be feasible, and I'll come to that. But in principle, in the first best world, we ought to allow for differences in fuel taxes depending on the age of the car. Then we have a tax. This is an ownership tax of the car. So the household has to pay a tax proportional to the value. This is not the value of the car. This is the number of the car. So it has nothing to do with the value. It's per car. A difference between old and new car. And then they only purchase the car once, but the tax has to be paid for 2 periods because the car is alive for 2 periods. And so they will pay for the car once, but the tax for 2 periods. So that's the only unusual thing about this budget constraint. There are no profits in the automotive industry here. It would be if there was a subsidy towards clean technology, but or fuel efficient technology, but not here. That. Then we're looking at optimal taxes. So we're looking at first best taxation. So we first solve the planner's problem, and then we solve the decentralized problem, and we ask ourselves which level of tax rates will implement the first best. And what we get are PGU taxes, and they are consisting of different components. So looking at and they're all additives, so it's the classical additivity property of PGU taxes. It will contain different terms, different marginal substitution between whether it's pollution or congestion and consumption. So looking at the gasoline taxes, there are 2 components in there. One is correcting for pollution and another one for congestion. So in that expression, there will be the marginal utility of pollution and marginal utility for congestion. And they're typically non-uniform. So you, in the first best world, you ought to use different taxes for different vintages. But it's ambiguous in terms of whether you should tax old cars more at the petrol station or on new cars. Now, the environmental concerns, if they are strong, so the individual cares a lot about the environment, then you ought to have a higher petrol tax for the older cars. But if congestion is more important, then you ought to have a higher petrol tax for the new cars. And the reason is that in equilibrium, individuals will tend to drive the new car more because it's on the margin, because it's more fuel efficient. And that's the reason why you ought to discourage that if congestion externalities are important. The vehicle tax. So since there are 2 externalities pollution and congestion, we can't get away with just a petrol tax. We need a vehicle tax as well. And that one is going to correct for congestion externality. And again, that's typically non-uniform. But we can't say whether old cars should pay a higher tax or new cars. Now, we may not be able to tax cars of different ages or vintages differently in a petrol station. So it may be hard to enforce a different or non-uniform petrol tax. So we then look at the constrained problem where the petrol tax has to be the same across different vintages, and the expression we get for the optimal uniform petrol tax is a weighted average of the two petrol taxes that were to be implemented if they were non-uniform. And then the vehicle taxes now would have to correct for both pollution externalities and congestion externalities, because we can't do that through the non-uniform petrol tax. So that is, I'm just checking how much I have.
You have 2 minutes left.
That's good. So since we're not able to see whether old vehicles should be taxed more than new or vice versa, we calibrate the model, and we try to be as careful as possible, and we're simply able to. We've been able to do everything carefully, apart from the environmental preferences. So the household's weight on environmental quality, that parameter 5.4, that's something that we can't say anything about. We can say something about the preferences for or this utility from congestion by looking at the willingness to pay for, or studies have looked at willingness to pay to avoid congestion. So we could have done that, but there's one parameter in there which we can't. So everything will be contingent on that. So looking at the unconstrained optimal taxes, so this is when we can charge different petrol taxes at the petrol station. We can see that the old cars will have a higher fuel tax than new cars. So for all our parameterizations of the environmental preferences, while the new cars will have a higher road tax or ownership tax. But the quantitative is quite a small difference. The road tax is almost uniform numerically. In equilibrium, the new cars will be driven more than the older cars, which we expected. The other thing that we did was the unconstrained optimal taxes. So here, the optimal fuel tax then will be a weighted average of the other two at the optimum. But the road tax now is, well, numerically virtually the same across old cars and new cars. So the vehicle ownership tax is almost uniform. So so, well, I think I perhaps don't need to summarize. In a sense, the numerical computation show that the older cars would typically need a higher tax on fuel than the older cars, and the new cars a higher tax, ownership tax. If non-uniform taxes cannot be implemented, well, then also the the vehicle taxes are close to uniform. And I forgot to mention this. So if there are no congestion externalities, well, then the ownership tax is not needed. We can get away with just fuel taxes. So that's where I stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. Do we have questions? I see in the chat we have no question. Okay, okay, Marion. Okay, Marion has a question. So Marion, can you speak?
Hi, yeah, thanks for the paper, for the presentation. It was really interesting. I was wondering two things, as someone working on transport issues, but more with an empirical focus. I was wondering whether it would change your results if you were to assume increasing returns to scale, because my understanding is that the automobile industry has really important returns to scale. And my second question is that you consider pollution, I think similarly for global CO2 pollution and local air pollution, while we know that depending on the technologies used for cars, the two don't change the same way. So I'm thinking about the difference between diesel and gasoline, for example. Have you considered including this in your analysis, or do you think it would change anything to your results? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question. So, no, we didn't think of distinguishing, or at least not for now, between local pollution and global, which is an interesting question, actually. Yeah, there's something potentially that could be done. We presumably would need more instruments, that's my guess, to deal with that, but we can actually see how far can we get with fewer instruments in that world. So that's good. And the other question was, let's see if I remember that was about the scale of production.
Exactly.
So if we have increasing returns to scale in the automotive industry, we need to do something to have an equilibrium, because the firms, if they were competitive firms, they would make negative profits and wouldn't operate, other than we had a government subsidy. But a way out of that is to look at non-competitive markets, and perhaps that's more realistic when it comes to the automotive industry, that companies have market power, or at least marginally market power. I look at an oligopoly model, so that the rents would be enough to cover for the scale.
Okay, thanks.
The firms there would charge a premium on the cars, so they would do some of the indirectly the taxation themselves, in a sense jacking up the price for the household, but that would only be yes, it's hard to figure out in my head what would happen, but it's a good question, actually.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess I'm asking you because recently I read a paper more on the political economy of car manufacturing, and it sounded like it's a very important element that can qualitatively and quantitatively explain a lot about the kind of cars that are being produced, and just because the business model of these manufacturers are so much dependent on this increasing returns to scale. That's why I'm wondering whether it would change, and in what direction it would change your results.
Yeah, one thing is, if more instruments were needed. I don't think more instruments would be needed in that world. I think, or maybe we would need a purchase tax on vehicles, which tend to become subsidy when when there are non-competitive firms, but that is presumably needed. The question is then, yes, it's hard to say. I have a feeling that the optimal taxes, the first best optimal taxes, are going to have the similar structure. So if we can have a purchase tax on vehicles or subsidy on vehicles, we can get rid of price distortion, and we can allow the fuel taxes to do what they did before. Numerically, they would be different. Presumably, the vehicle taxes would be higher, and there would be a subsidy on purchasing the vehicles. Yes. So I think quantitatively, it would show up different. Yeah, good question.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the answer. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Can you please stop sharing your screen, Thomas, so we can move?
There we go.
Okay, thank you. Noemi, now you can share your presentation. We are going to move to the fourth presentation of today. Noemi Lizak presenting a paper on carbon tax in a production network, propagation and sectoral incidents. Floor is yours.
Thanks. Let me see if I can make it full screen. Does it work now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Thanks for being here today at this early morning presentation. So the work I'll present is joint work with my colleague Antoine de Wilder from Banque de France, and the usual disclaimer applies in the sense that it doesn't reflect the official bank views, but just our own views. The paper is about carbon tax in the production network and how it propagates and affects different sectors. So in terms of motivation, I think given that we're all in this session, we're pretty motivated to work on environmental issues and carbon tax. But in terms of policy debate, there's growing interest for the evaluation of climate change impacts and costs of transition. And this has also become a topic for central banking with the development of climate stress test scenarios. So that's what made us work on this topic. We started as a fairly applied contribution for stress test scenarios. So we decided to focus on what is considered as transition risk. So the transitioning of the economy towards a greener economy, and it's opposed to physical risk. And the idea is to look at the impact of a policy shock, which is a carbon tax based on greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of time horizon, what we have in mind for the implication of this model is like 5 to 10 years. And the idea is to look at the structural impact. So in terms of method, we will have a multiple sector model and multiple countries. And the advantage of this is that it can be then linked with the climate stress test methodology of the Banque de France, so coupled with both micro and macro prudential tools and also with other aggregate macro models that can be used for calibration. So I'll skip the literature in the interest of time, but I guess you can still look at it on the slides later on. In terms of result preview, so we'll develop a model that is static and general equilibrium, and with, as I said, a sectoral production network, allowing for substitution across inputs in the production and also across goods in the consumption. And in terms of geographical coverage, we restrict to 3 groups of countries. So we have France, the rest of the EU, and the rest of the world. And the policy experiment that we look at is the implementation of a carbon tax, either just in France or in the whole of EU, so France and the rest of the EU. And as an ad hoc example, we set the carbon price to 100 euros per ton of equivalent CO2 emissions. And the impact in terms of real GDP in France is about minus 1.2%. What we also see is that via the sectoral structure, the upstream sectors are more impacted than the downstream sectors. So if you look at the graphs on the right, it will show you the sectors that are most impacted when there's a tax on French products only. So as you would have guessed, it's like coke and oil or mining, but also agriculture, because we take into account methane emissions too. And the picture is relatively similar when you have a tax on European products and not only French products. But you can see that it has also diffusion effects towards the rest of the world. So the red bars are for rest of the world mining and coke sectors, and they are impacted even though they are actually not taxed. So that's the diffusion through the sectoral production network. So let's start with the main model ingredients. On the production side, we have, as I said many times already, a sectoral production network. And in each sector, there's a firm that is perfectly competitive and that is producing and using inputs from the whole world. And its output is used both for intermediate and final consumption in the whole world. So that's the production side. It's actually the richest part of the model. And on the household side, we'll have one representative household per country that consumes a basket of goods from all sectors of all countries. And we'll have perfect risk sharing across countries. And in terms of taxes, we'll have 3 types of taxes that I will explain more in detail later, and all the proceeds are redistributed to the household. So that's the overview of the model. So to go a bit more into details on the production side, we have a nested CS structure for the production in each sector. So the output of a specific sector is an aggregate of energy, other inputs, and labor. And this energy inputs are an aggregate of oil and electricity in each of the countries. And the other inputs are an aggregate of the different goods produced in each of the countries. So what will be key is the substitution possibilities between these different inputs. On the household side, as I said, so the household consumes a basket of goods from the whole world. He supplies labor inelastically, and he'll receive the tax proceeds as a lump sum transfer based on her residence country. So if the tax is implemented in France, the tax proceeds will be redistributed to the French household. And one important assumption is that the households can trade internationally a complete set of erodable securities. So that implies that there is perfect risk sharing across countries. So that will imply transfers across countries. To close the model, we need to clear the markets. So on the labor market, we make the assumption that labor is perfectly mobile across sectors within one country, but there is no labor mobility across countries. And in each country, the wage adjusts to balance labor demand and labor supply. And on the goods market, it's like very standard. The production has to be equal to the intermediate and final consumption. So now on the taxes, we developed 3 different types of taxes to try and take into account all the emissions of greenhouse gases emitted by all the sectors and all the agents in the economy. So the first type, which is the simplest one, is on the household side. We set a final consumption tax, which is applied to the final consumption of oil and coke, and which will reflect the greenhouse gases emitted by the household in each country. So this tax rate is country specific. Then on the production side, it's a bit more challenging because we consider that we have somehow 2 types of emissions linked to production. So One is emissions related to burning oil or coke. And this is related to the consumption of oil and coke. But the other one can be related to the production process itself. So if you think of agriculture, the methane emitted by cows is not related to oil or coke production. It's just inherent to the fact of having cows. So we try and distinguish between those two types of emissions by having two types of taxes. So one will be an intermediate consumption tax on oil and coke, and the second one will be a production tax. So basically the intermediate consumption tax is related to each producer's consumption of oil and coke, and it will relate to CO2 emissions of that sector. And the production tax will be related to non-CO2 emissions in each sector, so methane for agriculture. And this will be set on total production depending on the emissions of that sector. So basically, when you produce meat from a cow, you will have a tax on that meat that will just depend on the quantity of meat. So this will have different effects on incentives of the producer. So the intermediate oil consumption tax will incentivize the producer to use less oil and more electricity, say. But the production tax, it's related to just the quantity produced. So the producer itself will not be able to substitute to decrease the amount of tax he pays. But the consumer of that good will face a higher price and may divert their consumption towards other goods that are less polluted and less taxed. So the incentive effect is different. So in terms of calibration, we use the World Input-Output Database. So the latest version is from 2014. And we aggregate it into the 3 blocks of country I mentioned earlier. So France, the rest of the EU, and the rest of the world. And for each country, we have 55 sectors. So one of the limitations of this data is that in terms of energy, we have only 2 sectors, one that groups oil and coal, and the other one that regroups electricity, gas, steam, and air conditioning. So we will consider that the oil and coal sector is dirty energy, and the electricity and gas one is clean energy. It has its limits, obviously, because it includes gas, but it's an approximation, and we don't have better data at the international level to have something more precise. And for the substitution elasticities that you can find in the production function and in the consumption function, we calibrate them according to the literature. So we will be on the relatively high side for instance, the elasticity of substitution between other inputs with 0.4, because we consider that we're interested in a relatively long time horizon, 5 to 10 years, so that substitution is actually possible with a bit of time. It's not a very rigid production function. And to calibrate the tax rates, basically for each type of tax, the underlying idea is that the proceeds of the tax, given a certain carbon price, should be equal to the price of the emissions of that sector. So for instance, for the household, if the household emits a certain amount of tons of CO2 a year, the tax will be such that the proceeds of the tax is equal to the price of this CO2 emissions. And this will be the same for the tax on the intermediate oil consumption and for the production tax. So in terms of policy experiment, we consider 2 scenarios, one where only France is applying the carbon tax and one where France and the EU are applying the carbon tax. And we set the price of carbon equal to 100 euros. So total tax receipts are somewhat higher in the rest of the EU than in France. And this is due to the higher level of emissions in the rest of the EU. So to give you an idea of the tax rates, so for the intermediate oil consumption tax, we actually have fairly high tax rates, and these will depend on each sector, because the tax rate is related to the sectoral emissions and to the oil consumption of each sector. So you can see, for instance, that the electricity sector is way more heavily taxed in the rest of the EU than in France. And this is related to the important presence of nuclear energy in the electric sector in France. And that's not the case in the rest of the EU. For the production tax, that will be related to non-CO2 emissions. So you can see that the agriculture is more heavily taxed because of the methane emissions, same for sewage. And we have some exceptions for basic metals and minerals because they emit a lot of CO2 inherently to their production process. So we affect these emissions to the production tax. And last, for the final oil consumption tax on households, it's about 40% in France and 30% in the rest of the EU. So in terms of aggregate results, this table summarizes the impact on real value added and real consumption in the different countries. So the first thing we can see is that there is a fairly weak transmission across countries. So if there's a tax only in France, it will affect France real value added with an impact of minus 1.2%, but it barely doesn't affect the rest of the EU and the rest of the world, even though France is fairly linked to the rest of the EU in terms of trade. So the way the impact propagates through the economy is via both input prices and final goods prices. So with taxed inputs prices are higher, and so the producers will substitute in their input demands to try and use less polluting inputs. And the final good prices will also reflect the tax, so that the consumer, the households, will also substitute in their consumption basket. And given that this will generally increase prices and lower real wage, will have a recessionary effect, and so lower final demand and lower real consumption, where in the tax countries. So here France and here France and the EU. In terms of bilateral exchange rate, if we have a tax only in France, we can see that the real exchange rate for France will slightly appreciate because prices increase in France compared to the other countries. However, this does not have a strong income effect, and it's not enough to prevent the consumption decrease in France. And the same mechanism is in place when the tax is in the whole EU. We can just see that when the whole EU is taxed, then there is little change in the real exchange rate between France and the EU. It's basically very close to zero.
Sorry to interrupt, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, thanks. In terms of real trade, so it will have a recessionary effect on total trade. And this is consistent with real exchange rate movements. So the real exchange rate of France appreciates, hence French exports decrease. And then the recessionary effect in France's domestic economy will imply that the French imports also decrease. So then in terms of sectoral results, all after-tax prices tend to increase because they now include the tax. And in terms of competitiveness, you can see that the prices in the French goods for each sector are higher after tax. But if you also tax the EU, then the competitiveness effect is back to pretty much no impact between France and the EU. So if the tax is shared across countries, there is no loss of competitiveness for those countries. In terms of real value added across sectors, as you can see and as expected, the sectors that are most impacted are the coke and oil sector and the mining sectors. And there's a strong transmission to upstream sectors. So for instance, this mining sector impact is due to the lower demand for mining from the coke and oil sector. Again, you can see that you have a transmission to non-tax sectors via the sectoral network, the production network. So the green bars for the rest of the world are sectors that are not taxed, but still affected by the tax implementation in France and the EU. Last, so in terms of downstreamness and propagation, if we look at how downstream a sector is in the production network and how it is affected by the taxation system, and we can see that the more downstream you are, the less affected you are in terms of spillovers from other sectors that are taxed. And at a given level of emission, you can see like the red dots on the right graph are the sectors that are more downstream, and the green dots are the sectors that are less that are more upstream. So at a given sectoral emission level, the red, so more downstream sectors, are less affected than the green, more upstream sectors. And so we've done quite a lot of robustness checks. I will not go into details with that, but we can ask questions about it afterwards. And in conclusion, so we have a way to evaluate the medium run impact of a carbon tax with, as key ingredients, multiple sectors and multiple countries. We obtain an estimate of minus 1.2% of real GDP for France and minus 2% of real GDP for France when a carbon tax is implemented with a price of carbon equal to 100 euros per ton. And of course, there are caveats in the sense that we have no innovation, no proper technological innovation, and we have no infrasectoral heterogeneity in taxation. But we think it's already a useful tool. And first to look at, to be inserted in stress test scenarios frameworks, and also to look at carbon leakage and border tax, which we haven't done yet, but we plan to.
Okay, thank you very much, Noémie, for a very interesting presentation and talk. Does anybody have a question from the floor? Okay, I start maybe with a question. Okay, I see that you have said it in the extension, the idea of trying to go in the direction of trying to incorporate the carbon leakage within your framework. And that is exactly what I had in mind when listening to your presentation, more specifically when you just consider the France scenario, because that it's really unlikely that you have a carbon tax in France and production will simply stay in France without going to the countries outside France that have not introduced the carbon tax. So I was wondering if you can tell us something more about this extension to include carbon leakage, if you can, sorry, if you can, or if it's something that you have it in your mind but still haven't thought about how to do that.
So what is in the model is the production substitution that you have in mind, in the sense that French consumers will tend to deviate from French products if they are more expensive and rather buy products from non-taxed countries. This is already in the model. What we don't do is that we don't measure the impact on carbon emissions. So initially we had decided not to do it because we thought the ways of measuring it was very imperfect, in the sense that we can only look at the quantity produced by a sector in France. And we know that for that quantity, given the data, they emit so and so much CO2. So we can just do like a rule of thumb and say, okay, if the quantity decrease, the emissions decrease by the same. But the implementation of the tax will also have impacts on the use of oil versus electricity as energy. So that should change the actual emissions of the sector. And this is difficult to reflect into a rule of thumb to compute the new emissions. So because of that, initially we thought we prefer not to do it because it's too imprecise, but every time we get questions on carbon leakage, so we've decided we should actually look at it and do it even though it's imprecise. So I can't tell you more than that because we haven't done it. but yeah, that's why it's on our list.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other question? Okay, Thomas? You should unmute yourself. We cannot hear you.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, you mentioned risk sharing and RWA securities. Do you have uncertainty in the model, or was there any uncertainty in terms or anything stochastic in
there
the
is
model?
nothing stochastic per se, but when you introduce the tax, you jump from one steady state to another steady state, and so that will imply a change in the income of the consumers. And so this is a different state of the world. And so in the initial steady state, the consumers, like the households, will buy these assets that will give a different return, depending on the future state of the world. And the new taxation policy is one of those state of the world. That would be, I think, the most intuitive way to understand it. But basically, in these kind of models with that are static, you have to choose between perfect risk sharing and financial autarky. And with that, financial autarky doesn't really reflect what's happening in the world, so probably perfect risk sharing is a better approximation. And also financial autarky has weird impact. We've done it, and the impacts of taxation are fairly weird, with like, if you tax France, then you have an increase in French consumption because you have a very strong income effect, and that's obviously not what we want to get.
Okay, thank you very much. Should interrupt here because you're a bit late. Okay, thank you. Can you please stop sharing your presentation? And we can now move to the fifth presentation of today by Cecilia Marie on the importance of dynamics in climate policy, a comparison of input and consumption taxation in the agriculture sector. So you can share your presentation, Cecilia, and you can start. I will tell you when you have 2 minutes left.
It's perfect.
We can see it.
Okay, I'll just see if, yeah. So thanks for listening in this presentation. I think it relates nicely to the previous presentation that we just heard. And this is a joint work with my co-author Simon Christiansen, who is also at the Aarhus University. And I think my presentation is on the short side, so maybe we can catch a bit up on the time. Yes, I wanted to just start off with some motivation for this project, because when you tell economists that you're doing something about agriculture, then maybe they think it's a bit weird, because in economic terms, at least in a lot of industrialized countries, this is a rather small sector. I think in the data that we calibrate to, it accounts for around 5% of GDP. But as you can see on this graph by IPCC, agriculture together with forestry and land use actually constitutes around 1/4 of world greenhouse gas emissions. So in climate policy, it's actually a large sector. And as we also heard in the previous presentation, it's a bit weird to model maybe, and that's what we've tried to do. So our next motivation, which is actually also our result, is this graph. So you can see here on the second axis, we have percentage change in emissions by some policy. And after around 50 years, they reach the same steady state level here, the new emissions, but the paths are different, and hence these two policies are actually quite different if you look at the dynamic aspects of this. So this is also why we wanted to do this dynamic model, to actually see what goes on in the rather short run. Also because in climate policy, time is also always important, but here maybe it's even more important, because we are waiting for innovation and you know, and also just because you want to do something, and maybe you want to do something fast. Yeah. So I think you can say that our research question is that we want to compare instrument to lower greenhouse gas emissions, and we actually have the same reduction channels as the previous paper here. We want to both look at output reductions or changes in the output mix, but also changes to technology in these input substitutions. And we want to do this by comparing our two policies are input taxation, which is also, I think people also call it just carbon taxes. So this is where you just tax the polluting inputs. So economists would say that this is the classical efficient solution, just tax the polluting stuff. But then we also compare it with consumption taxation, which, as we talked about this leakage problem, we have modeled as an open economy, and then maybe there can be a case for consumption taxation, because then you can also tax foreign products. And I think the literature generally agrees that agriculture has rather high leakage externalities normally. So, and that is also what we find, even though that's not what the paper is about. Yeah, so I think I'll skip this in the interest of time, but of course we relate on these, or we build on these previous large models as the one we saw before, and then there's also a branch of related paper that do more like food taxation, but they don't have the supply side, and we have that, as you'll see. Yeah, so what we have done is that we've built a very disaggregated partial equilibrium model of the agricultural sector. And we've done this, we've modeled a small open economy, and then we've calibrated to the data of the Danish national accounts and also the national emissions inventories. So we can actually link emissions directly to the production function. And then we model convex adjustment costs on capital, which is quite important for all this, all the dynamics that you'll see. Yeah. So here we have the model overview. This is just a flow chart of the model. We have, I don't know if you can see what I point to, but yeah, we have the plant producers, then we have the animal producers, and then we have a demand side. So the plant producers, we have organic and conventional. They are linked together by a land market, and then they sell stuff directly to the consumers. They sell feed to the animals. The animal producers sell manure back to the plant producers, and they also sell meat and dairy to the demand side, which is both domestic and foreign. So these are the general flows of the model. And if we then look at the production function here, we have a nested SES function like the one we saw before, but this is for an aggregate good of plants. And we have all these, the bottom nodes, that's real physical input. So that's chemicals, land, synthetic fertilizer, manure, labor, buildings, machines, and then also electricity and fuel. And then each nest here constitutes of a top nest and two bottom nests. So for example, synthetic fertilizer, and this is organic fertilizer that produces fertilizer. Then you nest that together with land, you have fertilized land, etc. And the good thing about this is then that we can have different substitution elasticities in all the nests. And then you can see the nodes with the red circles around them. These are the nodes that generate emissions. So emissions are proportional to these, and of course scaled such that it makes sense how each, of course, all the nests don't emit equally much. And then we also have the capital inputs, which are building, machines, and land. Of course, land is a bit different because we have a fixed supply and we don't have any depreciation, but else we treat it as a standard capital input. Yeah. Then we also have, it's the same story for the animal producers, except that, of course, the production function is different. We have the herd stock that emits a lot because of all the methane and enteric fermentation and all the animal-specific stuff. But the story is the same. We have a nested SES function here. And then we produce an aggregate animal good. And I'm not going to talk more about this, but I should just say that, of course, this splits out again in different types of products with a nested constant elasticity of transformation. But I'm not going into detail with this. Yeah. And again, we have the capital inputs here, machines and buildings. Okay. So I think I'm only going to show you one equation, but this drives the dynamics. So I just wanted to show you the adjustment costs. This is the standard capital accumulation equation. We have some depreciation and some investment. And then as you can see here, you don't have to pay the adjustment costs if you only rebuild your depreciated capital. But if you want to do more than this, then you have to pay. In our case, we have these quadratic adjustment costs, but I think our results will hold for any convex adjustment costs that you want to implement. Yeah, okay. So our calibration, we do this standard calibration as people do in the CGE literature. We take the elasticities from the literature and then we calibrate the parameters of the remaining parameters of the SES function. And then the parameters from the adjustment costs, we calibrate these to match the agricultural specific adjustment speeds that are found in the literature. And that is around 2% per year, I think. So we match this in our model. Yeah. And then to make these two schemes comparable, we model a drop in emissions in steady state with the 2%. So that is not a lot, and this is simply because the sector will go bankrupt if we do much more than that in one of the cases. But if you're interested in this, we can talk about it afterwards. But here you can see the adjustments towards this new steady state. This was also the figure I showed you in the beginning. So we can see that the consumption, in the case of consumption taxation, the economy and then also the emissions, they adjust almost instantly. And then with input taxes or classical carbon taxes, we have this rather slow adjustment towards a new steady state. And if you take then the accumulated emissions, then we actually have the consumption tax over a period of 30 years, we actually have 70% larger emission reductions with this tax that adjusts so quickly. So here we have two questions. So why is this consumption tax, why is the economy adjusting so quickly to the consumption tax? And why is it adjusting rather slowly to the input tax? And to understand this, we can simply decompose this change in emissions. So because we have the small economy assumption, we can say that these changes in emissions, they come from technical changes. So this is changes to the production in the home country, and then also changes to the consumption in the home country. Because we assume that this tax, it doesn't affect the production technology in the rest of the world, and it doesn't affect the demand in the rest of the world. So here we have, if you look at in this upper left corner here, we have the emission reduction stemming from these technical changes or changes to the production technology. And we can see that they don't do this in the case of the consumption tax, which also makes sense because you don't incentivize firms to change anything if you just tax the consumer. But in the case of the input tax, we have more than 50% of the emission reduction stemming from this, from technical change. And the technical changes happen slowly because of the adjustment costs, because it's simply too expensive to up or downsize all at once, so they implement this slowly. In the upper right corner here, we have the reduction from changes to consumption. And this happens instantly in the case of the consumption tax because they're simply faced with a tax at one point in time, and then they adjust their demand. And in the case of the input tax, it happens slowly again. And it does this because we can see here down in the left corner, because of the prices. So the prices, yes, the tax happens instantly, but here the prices have, the change here happens slowly because in the case of the input tax, the change stems from the production side, which is adjusting slowly because of the adjustment costs. But then we can ask, why is is it realistic that we just say that the suppliers, they have to adjust slowly because it's too expensive? So why can the consumers then adjust quickly, because they have to consume what is being produced, right? But this is, of course, because we have this open economy. So even if, so the net export balance actually, it acts such like a buffer, because then you can simply just change your imports and exports, and the rest of the world is sufficiently big so they can, so these changes for the rest of the world, they're small, so they can just, even if they have the adjustment cost, the convex adjustment cost, they can change their production instantly, because we model a small country. So this is also what you can see here, that the export and the import jumps in the case of the consumption tax, and then it just adjusts slowly here in the case of the input tax, because the domestic country actually changes its production slowly. Yeah. Let me just check the time. Yeah. So the last thing that I just mentioned here, if we just look at the utility from the consumers and the producers, you can say that land prices can be some sort of a measure of utility for the producers, because when all other inputs are paid, then the return to land is what is left for the producers. And you can see here that if we start with the land prices, that the land prices are almost unaffected by the consumption tax. But for the input tax, they're really hit quite hard. And this is also why we can't implement the large taxes, simply because if we start taxes domestic production only, then at some point there's no return to land left. And then we have over for the consumers, of course, they're hit a little harder by this consumption tax, because then they take all the fault, because they're hit with a tax directly on them. Yeah, I think I'll just stop the presentation here, but just to sum up, we have found that in a small open economy with these convex adjustment costs on capital, consumption taxes result in a much faster transition, and then also in a larger accumulated emission drop for the same steady state level. I haven't talked so much about this, but the costs are shared with the rest of the world when using this consumption tax, because you actually make the rest of the world change their production just a bit. On the other hand, input taxes really hit these land prices rather hard, but consumer utilities then hit harder by the consumption tax compared with the input tax. And then I've also talked about the small taxes. I think our taxes, we had that, the first presentation talked about these, the carbon price. I think our carbon price is only around $10 per carbon equivalent. So this is, even for the most optimistic people, this is a small tax. But this has something to do with its leakage externality. Yeah. I think I'll stop here and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Cecilia, for a very nice presentation and talk. We have already one question in the chat from Isabella. So Isabel, if you want, you could raise the question yourself.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, so you said that you can't introduce very high taxes because at some point there's going to be no production, but isn't that possible to change that by just introducing a lump sum transfer of the tax?
Yes, right now we don't account for the tax revenue. We have discussed this quite a lot, if we should transfer the revenue back. Right now we have just a fixed budget for the consumers, so they're compensated in some way. But we have talked about if we should, maybe we should just make a scenario where we transfer some of the revenue back to the producers. So
I mean that's the usual assumption in like general equilibrium models. So I don't see why.
Yes, I think this is good. Yeah. I think the reason we didn't do this is because this is actually a partial equilibrium model, right? Because we don't, we have some things that are not accounted for. We actually have a framework where we can incorporate this in a larger model, and I think we're going to do this. but I think it's a valid point that we should actually experiment with transferring this revenue back to the producers. Yeah, thank you.
Any other question? Noemi, you can raise your question if you want.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. I had just a question regarding the quantity of emissions, because what you show when you do the consumption tax is that consumption of the domestic product really decreases a lot. But then basically there's some kind of swap happening. So the domestic agricultures export their production to the foreign country, and the domestic consumer consumes the foreign production. So this huge drop in emissions, isn't that a bit like misleading in the sense that in the end, there's still emissions, an increase in emissions in a foreign country that may compensate the drop in emissions in the home country? Like, can you actually compute the total emissions to take into account this kind of leakage?
Yes, so we have taken account for all the emissions that I've shown here. We have tried to take account for leakage in those. So these are, we assume in the consumption case, we assume that that the rest of the world's consumption is just constant, right? So if we export more, then it doesn't matter, because then they don't produce the goods themselves. But it's not like, yeah, so we have taken account for leakage in that sense. And in the same, if we have then that they import more, we don't say that, okay, then we can just see this drop on the national account. So this is like a real drop in emissions. We don't say that. So I think we should have taken account for that. Of course, it's imprecise because we don't know the technologies of the rest of the world, but we just assume that they produce with the same technology as the home country. So.
Okay, so then you take into account that the rest of the world also produces more.
Yes, we take that into account, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and if we don't, we have a scenario where we don't take that into account, and then the input taxation case becomes a lot better for, so if we just have a domestically centered social planner in the home country, then the input taxation would be much better, because then they can just, because then they simply just import a lot of stuff and they stop producing in the home country, and then they look very green. But of course, that's just leakage. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, speakers, and thank you, participants, for joining this very fruitful and insightful discussion. So the session is now over. My greetings to everybody.